There are people who never raise their voice, never insult you outright, never do anything dramatic, yet somehow you always walk away feeling smaller than you were before. You tell them good news, and their reaction makes you feel like you're exaggerating. You share something meaningful, and they respond with something that makes you second-guess yourself. You try to express a need, a fear, or even a boundary, and suddenly you feel unreasonable, dramatic, or difficult. They don't have to say, "You're not enough." Your body hears it anyway. It's a strange kind of erosion, slow, subtle, almost invisible while it's happening. You feel it in the silence after their comment. In the way they dismiss something important to you. In the way you find yourself explaining, justifying, shrinking, trying harder without knowing why. A part of you knows something's wrong, but another part keeps wondering if you're overreacting or being too sensitive. And that confusion becomes the real trap. When you no longer trust your own perception, you become dependent on the very person who's distorting it. This experience is far more common, and far more psychological, than most people realize. Because people who make you feel not good enough rarely look like villains. They often appear calm, rational, collected. They seem confident. They seem harmless. Sometimes they even seem caring. Which is why the impact hits so deeply. The moment someone positions themselves as the voice of reason, it becomes easier for you to assume you must be the irrational one. But here is the part you've likely never been told: your reaction is not irrational at all. It's diagnostic. Your nervous system picks up emotional patterns long before your mind finds the words. It recognizes subtle superiority, emotional withholding, selective warmth, dismissive responses, or inconsistent validation. It notices when someone's presence makes you feel uncertain about who you are. It remembers how it feels to be emotionally minimized. Before your thoughts can form a sentence, your body already knows, something here is not safe for my sense of self. Feeling not enough in someone's presence is not an overreaction, it's a signal. A signal that the dynamic is unequal. A signal that your worth is being passively downgraded. A signal that your nervous system is bracing for subtle devaluation. And the most painful part is this: you often don't realize how much you've been shrinking until you step away from the person and suddenly feel bigger again. This video isn't about blame or accusation. It's about clarity. Because once you understand the psychology of people who need others to feel small, and the psychology of why you are affected by them, something powerful happens. The confusion dissolves. The self-doubt loosens. And you begin to see the dynamic for what it truly is, not what you've been conditioned to feel inside it. Some people make you feel like you're not enough, not because you aren't enough, but because they don't know how to feel enough on their own. And once you understand that, everything begins to change. One of the most disorienting parts of dealing with someone who makes you feel not good enough is how quietly it all happens. There's rarely a dramatic moment you can point to. No clear injury. No obvious cruelty. Instead, it's the accumulation of small shifts, a slight change in tone, an unimpressed reaction, a dismissive shrug, a comment delivered with a smile that somehow cuts deeper than an insult ever could. These micro-moments work like emotional static, disrupting your internal clarity until your confidence feels out of tune. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as micro-invalidations, subtle cues that communicate, you're less. Your feelings matter less. Your experience is less valid than mine. People who use this style of relating almost never say those words directly. They don't have to. Their behavior does the speaking for them. They do it when they interrupt you just as you start to share something meaningful. They do it when they frame your accomplishments as luck rather than effort. They do it when their praise feels strategically withheld. They do it when they act bored by your excitement but animated by someone else's. They do it when they pose as the voice of reason in situations where your feelings are actually appropriate. This dynamic is so hard to recognize because it wears a mask, the mask of normalcy. The person may appear calm, logical, even grounded. You, in contrast, feel increasingly emotional, confused, or self-doubting. And because they present themselves as steady, it becomes easy to assume that the imbalance is coming from you. But this is the sleight of hand. People who need to feel superior rarely look superior. They look composed. Neutral. Above it all. Their superiority is coded in the subtext, in the way they position themselves as the standard against which everything else is measured. You say something vulnerable, they respond with detachment. You express excitement, they respond with skepticism. You share an idea, they critique it before considering it. You express hurt, they imply you misunderstood. Every time this happens, the message lands the same: your reality is a little less real than theirs. And the more often it happens, the more your nervous system tries to adjust. You speak more carefully. You reveal less openly. You rely more on their reactions to know how you should feel. You start positioning yourself beneath them without even realizing the shift occurred. This is not weakness. This is the psychology of relational conditioning. Humans are wired to attune to the people around them, especially those who talk with emotional authority, people who sound sure of themselves, even when they're wrong. When someone consistently plants themselves in that position, your brain assumes they must know something you don't. It's an ancient social reflex. If someone signals dominance, the safer strategy is often submission. But beneath that reflex lies something even more important: your desire for connection. You don't shrink because you're fragile. You shrink because you're trying to preserve the relationship. You shrink because confrontation feels costly. You shrink because you've been taught, often long ago, that it's easier to make yourself smaller than to risk the connection collapsing. This is why subtle superiority is so psychologically effective. It doesn't attack your worth. It nudges you into questioning it. And when someone makes you constantly question yourself, they don't have to control you directly, the uncertainty does the work for them. But here's the crucial truth: if someone genuinely believed in their own worth, they would never need to make you doubt yours. Superiority is almost always a compensation, a shield, a strategy. And the people who use it rely on one thing above all: that you won't recognize the pattern until you're already tangled in it. Now we turn to the deeper layer, where this behavior begins, and why some people grow up needing others to feel small. People who make you feel not good enough don't wake up one day and decide to operate that way. Their behavior is not spontaneous, it's patterned. And nearly always, the pattern begins in an emotional environment where worth was conditional, fragile, or constantly threatened. In childhood, identity is built relationally. A child learns who they are through the mirrors around them, the attention they receive, the tone they're met with, the stability or instability of the people they depend on. When the mirror is warm and attuned, a child naturally develops internal worth. But when the mirror is inconsistent, dismissive, demanding, or hypercritical, the developing self takes on a very different shape. There are several pathways that commonly lead a person to elevate themselves by subtly diminishing others. They don't all look dramatic on the outside, but they're profoundly shaping on the inside. The child who could never measure up. Some children grow up under the weight of impossible expectations, not just academic or behavioral, but emotional. Praise was scarce. Approval was rationed. Love felt tied to performance. Nothing was enough unless it was perfect. These children learn early that in order to feel safe, they need to stay ahead of criticism, ahead of mistakes, ahead of vulnerability. Adulthood doesn't erase this pressure, it converts it. Instead of striving to feel enough, they begin positioning themselves as above. Superiority becomes their shield. Critique becomes their way of staying in control. Minimizing others becomes a way of temporarily silencing their own lifelong fear of inadequacy. The child who was never truly seen. Some children grow up with caregivers who were physically present but emotionally unreachable. Love wasn't spoken, attunement wasn't offered, and the child's inner world was invisible. This emotional neglect leaves a child with a fragmented sense of value, not low, but undefined. To avoid the unbearable discomfort of feeling insignificant, they build an identity anchored in being the one who knows more, judges more accurately, or holds the emotional upper hand. If they can't feel valuable internally, they'll create value externally, often by subtly positioning themselves above the people closest to them. The child who grew up in competition. In some families, affection, attention, or belonging became a zero-sum game. One child's success meant another child's loss. Praise was comparative. Love was scarce. This environment teaches a dangerous rule: if someone else shines, you dim. In adulthood, that rule lives on. To keep the inner threat of diminishment away, they preemptively diminish others. Not through obvious cruelty, but through a steady, strategic drip of superiority. The child who learned power the wrong way. Some children witnessed adults using dominance, emotional, verbal, psychological, to keep control. They internalized power not as leadership, but as hierarchy. Not as collaboration, but as positioning. They weren't just influenced, they were trained. In adulthood, they mirror the model they grew up with, the one who stays above criticism, above vulnerability, above equal footing. Equality feels unsafe. Superiority feels familiar. But here is where clarity matters. Childhood explains behavior. It does not excuse it. A painful past may shape someone. It may help us understand them. It may illuminate why they default to control, criticism, or minimization. But it does not justify harming others. It does not make emotional injury acceptable. And it does not mean you must tolerate someone shrinking your sense of self. People who make others feel small often carry unhealed wounds, but those wounds belong to them. When they project those wounds outward, when they build their worth by eroding someone else's, they are making a choice. A pattern may be unconscious, but its impact is not. And the cost of that impact lands on the person closest to them, often the most sensitive, caring, emotionally attuned person in the room. When someone chips away at your sense of worth, it doesn't just bruise your feelings, it activates something much older, much deeper, and much more automatic. Most people assume that criticism hurts because it's rude, or because it's personal, or because it's unfair. But what actually hurts is the way the body interprets the interaction. Your nervous system reads emotional cues the way a seismograph reads earthquakes, instantly, instinctively, and without your permission. And when someone consistently makes you feel not enough, their behavior doesn't just echo in your mind. It echoes in your past. People who wound you in this way often strike the exact frequency of your early emotional conditioning, even if your childhood wasn't chaotic or traumatic in the traditional sense. There are a few reasons why these dynamics land so sharply, and they're almost never about weakness. You were trained to take things personally, not by flaw, but by survival. As a child, you depended on the emotional environment around you. If the adults were unpredictable, inconsistent, dismissive, or overwhelmed, your survival strategy became: monitor everything. Make it about me so I can fix it. You didn't do this because you were self-centered. You did it because you were powerless. Children can't change the environment, so they change themselves in response to it. They shrink, soften, apologize, please, hyper-attune. And the body learns a dangerous equation. If something feels off, I must be the cause. This reflex doesn't disappear in adulthood. It just flows into your relationships. So when someone makes you feel not enough, even subtly, your nervous system reacts as if you're responsible for the emotional imbalance. This isn't weakness. It's conditioning. Your system is wired for connection, and threat to connection feels like threat to safety. Humans are attachment-based creatures. We don't survive alone. The brain is built to interpret relational cues as safety signals. So when someone implies, directly or indirectly, that you're not enough, your body doesn't interpret it as an opinion. It interprets it as a rupture. A threat to closeness. A threat to belonging. A threat to harmony. That's why these interactions don't feel like just words. Your nervous system registers them as danger. You may have a history of emotional responsibility. Highly sensitive, intuitive, or emotionally intelligent people often grow up carrying the emotional weight of others. They notice shifts before anyone else does. They soothe. They compensate. They become the regulator in their family. When you've spent your life cushioning the emotional impact of others, being around someone who diminishes you hits in a double way. It violates your impulse to keep connection intact. It violates the silent rule you learned: if someone is unhappy, it's my fault to fix. So their insecurity becomes your burden. Their dissatisfaction becomes your mistake. Their superiority becomes your shame. Except none of it is yours. Their pattern hooks into your most vulnerable longing. People who make others feel small tend to target the places where you most desire connection, not always deliberately, but effectively. Their criticism lands at the intersection of your desire to be understood, your desire to be valued, your desire to feel safe, your desire for stability, your desire for reciprocity. And when someone threatens those needs, the wound hits with surgical precision. Your empathy becomes a liability in the wrong hands. Empathy is a gift, until someone uses it against you. People with fragile egos often gravitate toward deeply empathetic individuals because empathy makes you interpret their behavior as hurt rather than harm. Try to understand them rather than protect yourself. Excuse patterns instead of confronting them. Fix their emotions instead of honoring yours. Your compassion becomes the door through which they walk into your self-worth. And here's the crucial realization. If someone's behavior consistently makes you feel inadequate, your reaction doesn't mean you're broken, it means they're touching a wound you didn't create. Your distress is not proof of their accuracy. Your sensitivity is not proof of your insufficiency. Your reaction is not proof that you deserve it. It's proof that something inside you was shaped to carry more than it should, and someone else is benefiting from that pattern. It's painful to admit, but some people don't treat everyone the same way. They don't make everyone feel small, they make certain people feel small. And if you've ever wondered, why me? Why does this person treat others better than they treat me? There is a reason, and it has nothing to do with your worth. People who rely on diminishing others are drawn to individuals who embody what they lack, highlight what they fear, or soothe what they cannot manage internally. The dynamic is not random. It's predictable. Often, they're drawn to people with softness, because softness feels safe. They choose those who listen, who care, who don't escalate conflict, who try to understand rather than retaliate. Your emotional intelligence disarms them, and ironically, that disarming quality makes you the easiest person to one-up. They're also attracted to people who carry quiet strength. Not dominance, not loud confidence, but a steady, grounded presence. This subtle strength threatens them, even if you don't flaunt it. Putting you down becomes a way for them to regain a sense of control. They don't attack people who can't impact them, they attack people whose presence exposes their own instability. Another reason you become the target is because you actually care about the connection. You value the relationship, so you're more willing to repair, reflect, or take responsibility, even when the situation isn't yours to fix. They sense this. They feel the weight of your investment. And because they lack internal stability, they use your desire for harmony as leverage. People who make others feel small are also drawn to those with an open heart. Your warmth activates an ache in them, a longing they never learned how to satisfy. Instead of rising to meet the level of connection you offer, they lower you to match the emotional environment they're comfortable in. They're not trying to understand you, they're trying to manage their own discomfort by shrinking what feels too bright. There's also something deeply magnetic about individuals who are self-reflective. When you're willing to question yourself, they don't need to question themselves. When you're open to self-improvement, they feel justified in offering endless critiques. When you're quick to consider your impact, they avoid considering theirs. Your introspection becomes the perfect mask for their avoidance. And perhaps most importantly, they target you because your boundaries are kind, not cold. You don't punish people. You don't humiliate them. You don't retaliate in ways that injure. For someone who fears vulnerability, your gentleness feels like an open door they can step through without consequence. It's not that you lack boundaries, it's that you try to uphold them without causing harm. They interpret this as permission, not humanity. The truth is, you become the target because you make them feel emotions they do not know how to manage: admiration, envy, inferiority, longing, dependence, fear of abandonment, or even a strange mix of respect and resentment. Your presence pulls on threads inside them that were never resolved. But here is the piece that changes everything. They treat you this way not because you are weak, but because you are safe. You are the one who won't explode. You are the one who won't retaliate. You are the one who still tries when they stop trying. You are the one whose empathy blinds them to their own behavior. You are the doorway through which they express the parts of themselves they refuse to confront. That is why the dynamic feels so personal. That is why the criticism pierces so deeply. That is why the relationship feels unbalanced from the very beginning. And yet, despite the pull, despite the emotional gravity of these dynamics, something vital must be understood: you cannot heal someone by letting them harm you. When someone repeatedly makes you feel not enough, the damage doesn't begin with their words. It begins with the silence that follows, the moment when you start talking to yourself the way they talk to you. The moment when their voice merges with your own internal dialogue. The moment when doubt stops feeling like doubt and starts feeling like truth. You don't just question what happened. You question who you are. These dynamics work slowly, subtly. There's no single betrayal, no single moment of cruelty that defines the problem. Instead, it's the accumulation, the steady erosion of your confidence, the gradual shrinking of your emotional space, the quiet rewriting of your expectations for love, respect, and reciprocity. At first, you justify their behavior. Then, you negotiate with it. Then, you adapt to it. Finally, you absorb it. You start seeing yourself through their eyes, not because their perception is accurate, but because it's the one you've been exposed to the most intensely. Even if you intellectually know they're projecting their insecurities onto you, a part of you still wonders. What if they're right about me? What if I really am too much? What if I really am not enough? This confusion doesn't come from weakness. It comes from repetition. The nervous system updates itself based on frequency, not fairness. When someone keeps you slightly off balance, praising you just enough to keep you close, criticizing you just enough to keep you small, your emotional reality starts to warp. You begin filtering your behavior through their imagined reactions. You walk on eggshells even when they're not in the room. You rehearse conversations in your mind to prevent conflict. You downplay your accomplishments. You censor your joy. You shrink your needs. And the saddest part is that this shrinking doesn't feel like oppression at first. It feels like responsibility. It feels like kindness. It feels like your job. It feels like keeping the peace. Eventually, the exhaustion sets in. Not the kind that sleep can fix, but the kind that comes from constantly self-monitoring. The kind that comes from never feeling allowed to relax. The kind that turns every interaction into emotional labor. Your self-worth begins to tie itself to one question: am I good enough for them? But worth measured through someone else's comfort is not worth, it's captivity. And captivity has consequences. It narrows your world. It narrows your choices. It narrows your voice. It narrows your very sense of who you are. You start losing the parts of yourself that once felt effortless: your humor, your ease, your spontaneity, your creativity, your confidence. These parts don't disappear because they were never real, they disappear because they were never welcome in the dynamic. Slowly, your emotional landscape reorganizes itself around one central task: avoiding the feeling of inadequacy. And every ounce of energy you spend proving your worth to them is energy stolen from the life you could be living, the passions you could be following, the relationships that could actually nourish you. But something inside you remains untouched, the quiet part that notices. The part that says, this doesn't feel right. The part that hesitates before apologizing for something that wasn't your fault. The part that longs for ease, mutual respect, softness, safety. The part that remembers, even faintly, what it felt like not to brace. That part of you is not damaged. It's buried. And the moment you become aware of this dynamic, truly aware, something begins to shift. Awareness interrupts the pattern. Awareness creates space. Awareness gives you the language for what has been happening inside you. Awareness restores the voice that was pushed into silence. Because recognizing the dynamic is the first moment you step out of it. Not fully. Not instantly. But enough to breathe. Enough to question. Enough to reclaim the parts of yourself that were never meant to be sacrificed in the first place. There comes a point, sometimes quietly, sometimes in a moment of breaking, when you realize that the person who keeps making you feel not enough isn't just shaping how you feel about them, they're shaping how you feel about yourself. And once you see that, truly see it, the dynamic can no longer continue unchanged. Awareness doesn't magically fix everything, but it disrupts the spell. It opens a door you can't close again. It invites you to step towards something you haven't felt in a long time, your own dignity. Breaking this cycle doesn't begin with confrontation. It begins with clarity. Clarity about what is yours and what never was. Clarity about the difference between guilt and manipulation. Clarity about the difference between humility and self-erasure. Clarity about the subtle ways you've been taught to doubt your own goodness. The first shift happens internally. You stop asking, why am I not enough for them? And you start asking, why do they need me to feel small in order to feel stable? That single reframing flips the entire dynamic. Because once you understand that their behavior comes from their own unprocessed wounds, inadequacies, insecurities, and distortions, you stop internalizing the emotional weight they hand you. You can feel compassion for their story without confusing it for your responsibility. You can understand their pain without becoming the container for it. And slowly, something begins to loosen inside you. You begin to reclaim your right to interpret yourself. Your right to feel competent. Your right to take up space. Your right to be imperfect without punishment. Your right to exist without performing. And as you reclaim these rights, the dynamic starts to destabilize, not because you're doing anything aggressive, but because their old strategies no longer land the way they used to. The comments that once pierced you now feel transparent. The guilt that once controlled you now feels misplaced. The manipulation that once confused you now feels predictable. You begin responding from your present self, not your wounded self. And nothing disrupts a power imbalance faster than self-possession. But this shift often brings a surprising emotional reaction: grief. Grief for the years you spent shrinking. Grief for the parts of yourself you silenced. Grief for the moments you apologized for existing. Grief for the love you kept giving into a space that could not hold it. Grief for the version of you that genuinely believed this dynamic was love, connection, or normalcy. This grief isn't a setback. It's awakening. Because as you grieve what you lost, you also begin to recognize what you still have, the ability to choose differently. To feel differently. To separate kindness from self-sacrifice, and loyalty from self-neglect. You begin to see that the person who made you feel not enough was never the one who could show you your worth. Worth is not proven through suffering. Worth is not negotiated. Worth is not dependent on another person's emotional weather. Worth is something you return to, not something you earn. As your sense of worth strengthens, you begin setting boundaries without fear. Not dramatic walls, just quiet lines that say, I don't abandon myself to keep this connection alive. And these boundaries become not just protection, but clarity. They reveal who is capable of meeting you with respect, and who only thrives when you remain small. Some people will adjust, surprisingly. Some will resist, predictably. Some will disappear, painfully. But every reaction gives you information. Every reaction shows you who can exist with you at your full size. And who only knew how to love you when you were half of yourself. Breaking the cycle isn't just about stepping away from someone who hurts you. It's about stepping toward the person you were before you were taught to shrink. A self who doesn't apologize for being whole. A self who doesn't chase love to feel worthy. A self who doesn't mistake criticism for connection. A self who knows that feeling small was never a reflection of your value, only a reflection of someone else's wounds. And once you begin to inhabit that version of yourself, even for a moment, the entire emotional world shifts. Your relationships shift. The way you interpret silence, tone, conflict, closeness, all of it shifts. You stop living reactively. You start living from truth. Your truth. Your worth. Yourself. There's a moment, often subtle, when everything you've learned about this dynamic begins to gather inside you as one truth: you were never the problem. Not then. Not now. Not in the eyes of anyone capable of seeing you clearly. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet part of you, the part that has always known you were worthy, finally exhales. Because the truth is, you never lacked value. You lacked environments that reflected it. People who make you feel not enough do not reveal your worth. They reveal the limits of their own emotional capacity. Some people simply cannot meet others without needing a hierarchy, consciously or unconsciously. They don't feel safe unless someone else is beneath them. They don't feel stable unless someone else is uncertain. They don't feel strong unless someone else is shrinking. But their inability to stand beside you was never evidence that you were unworthy. It was evidence that they were unfinished. Their story unresolved. Their wounds unaddressed. Their inner world so fragile that your confidence, your light, your authenticity threatened the scaffolding holding their identity together. And yet, you adapted. You tried to fit inside the small space their insecurity offered you. You tried to earn approval that could never be given without conditions. You tried to be good enough for someone who needed you to stay unsure. You learned to walk lightly, speak softly, apologize quickly, or perform endlessly, not because this was who you are, but because this was what the dynamic demanded. But now, something else is happening. You're seeing the pattern. You're naming it. You're stepping outside of it long enough to observe it rather than obey it. And once you can see a pattern, you're no longer living inside it blindly. This is how cycles end, not with explosive confrontation, but with awareness so honest that pretending becomes impossible. With self-worth so real that shrinking starts to feel unnatural. With clarity so sharp that you can finally separate yourself from the behavior of people who could not love without diminishing. And that's the turning point. When someone tries to make you feel small, you no longer collapse inward. You recognize the maneuver for what it is, a reflection of them, not a verdict on you. When they withhold praise, you no longer interpret the silence as failure, you understand it as emotional limitation. When they criticize you unfairly, you no longer scramble to fix yourself, you see that the criticism was never about truth, only control. When they hint, or manipulate, or destabilize, you no longer lose your footing, because you're standing on something that doesn't shift anymore. Your self-regard. Your clarity. Your origin. Your worth. And with this, something extraordinary happens, their power dissolves. Not because they changed, but because you did. Because the version of you they controlled is no longer the version standing here now. You don't need permission to take up space. You don't need validation to feel solid. You don't need their approval to know you are enough. You were enough before they arrived. You are enough now. And you will be enough long after their voice stops echoing in your mind. The story they taught you about yourself was never yours. You do not need to carry it forward. This is your return, to yourself, to your worth, to the dignity that was never missing, only quiet. You don't rise by proving anything to them. You rise by remembering who you were before you learned to doubt. And that is the ending they could never write for you,